Good morning. So, no matter who you are or where you are in your spiritual journey, you are celebrated here. And thank you, Corbin, for making sure that we go out to those people who are watching online. I don't look at demographics, but Tim told me that we have about it as many watching online as we do today, as they're here in person. Probably today more online. So you're welcome. And I don't mean to make you feel bad or guilty, but if you live within 25 miles, you should be here.
Pajamas are pretty seductive, though. I said pajamas are pretty seductive, though. Maybe you should let us come in our pajamas.
Wear your pajamas to here
someday. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
So, there's a backdrop to what we're doing today. That's the drownings in the hill country. And I would be remiss not to mention that.
Yeah.
I am in both services today and have the assignment of doing a pastoral prayer. And I wanted to acknowledge that, and also the fact that today we celebrate a baptism in the church. So we have sorrow and joy cheek to cheek right in there. And it's kind of how the context in which we live our lives. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that. So let's begin in silence. May grace be in our heads and in our thinking. May grace be in our eyes and in our seeing. May grace be in our ears and in our hearing. May grace be in our mouths and in our speaking. And may grace be in our hearts and in our understanding. And may grace be at our ends and at our departing. And may what we do in this time today contribute to patience, tolerance, compassion, love for all people everywhere. Amen. Next Sunday is going to be my last Sunday to teach before we go to accompany the choir on the trip to Lincoln, England, which I'm really looking forward to. And you'll have more information about that next week. What I wanted to let you be aware of this morning is that in the morning, for those of you who are on the email list to get the previews and summaries, and if you're not, you can go on ordinarylife.org and sign up today. I don't know how that works, but in the morning, there will be an email sent out announcing and giving you the opportunity to sign up for a Substack that I'm going to begin writing. The first one will go out, I think, next Monday. And the original intention for some of us who kind of work behind the scenes here is to find ways to get the word about Ordinary Life out to a wider audience. So initially, though, I'm going to be writing about my experience, our experience, the choir's experience in the cathedral in Lincoln. That kind of architecture is my drug of choice. I walk into something like the cathedral in Leon, Spain, and just wonder, where did this come from? And so I'm going to be writing about that. The cathedral in in Lincoln, when it was built, was the tallest structure on the planet. Bigger than the pyramids. And then something blew the top of it off and it lost its status. It was also the first place to house the Magna Carta. It's twice as big as Notre Dame. It's a historic place, so I'm really looking forward to being there. But anyway, you'll get that email in the morning, and then If you want to sign up for the Substack, you can. It's free, so I hope you watch it. I hope you sign up. So, do you know the phrase, out of all the phrases that people could say, that people love to hear the most? I love you. People love to hear that. I love you. You know the second phrase people like to hear the most of all the phrases? Thank you. As a matter of fact, this is somewhat based on hospice work, if you're dealing with somebody in that category. I love you, thank you. And so the third phrase that people love to hear, need to hear is, please forgive me, I forgive you. Those are the top three. You know what number 4 is? Some version of that. Meal's ready, come to lunch, let's eat together, whatever. So last week's teaching was about a most radical parable created by the early Jesus community about the inclusion of a hated collaborator with the Roman authorities, a Jewish man who had turned tax collector. Remember? His name's Levi. We know him as Matthew. And I fabricated the story where Jesus and his apostles are at a meal, and Jesus comes in, and he has his arm around this guy, and he says, hey guys, I want to introduce you to this new person who's going to be part of our group. Here is Levi. Now, that's pure fiction. I made that up. But it is not far-fetched, because the primary way Jesus practiced his teaching of inclusivity was at the common communal meal. That's the primary thing. Jesus got into more trouble because of who he ate with, when he ate, how he ate, than almost any other single thing that he did. The word companion comes from 2 words. The Latin word com, meaning with, and the word pan, meaning bread. So a companion is someone we break bread with. And so Jesus consistently chooses to prioritize the outsider, and he does that by the communal meal. And so that and the implications of that is what today's class is all about. So you can get back on your phone if you want to. No, don't do that.
Before jumping in, I just want to offer that grief is a really deep well, and you kind of go down that well in layers. And I hope that whatever layer you're experiencing around grief because of loved ones you know or people you know who have loved ones, that well, I hope, is encased in love. And I really believe that our grief is only ever tantamount to our love. So, with that, I was just in Milan, Italy, where Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper is housed in the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie. I didn't go. So it's even silly that I mention being there when I didn't make the trek over to see it. But Milan was really just an airport stop for us, where we spent a night in an airport hotel and an afternoon waiting for an airplane. But I read about the Last Supper. I was an history and art major in college, so of course I had to do a lot of studying about these classics, but it just prompted me to reread some of the symbology of the Last Supper. You remember the Da Vinci Code from like the early 2000s, and it kind of sucked a lot of us into the mystique of this painting. Some of it exaggerated for the purposes of fiction, but a lot of it true. And two of the most radical elements to me of this painting are, first, the probable presence of a woman right next to Jesus in the V formation is likely to be Mary Magdalene. Some say it's John the Baptist, but the feminine quality of this figure is evident. At the time, it would have broken social norms to have a woman at the table with men. Second is the presence of Judas, the other one circled in this painting, who we know was the betrayer, and often associated with this archetype of treachery and the shadow self. And for all intents and purposes, Judas is considered the enemy. Judas may also have been a fictional character, may have just been the symbol of our shadow self, the part that Jesus had to welcome in order to become transformed. But over and over in artistic representations, and also in what we understand of the parables and sayings of Jesus, he bucks traditionalism. A couple of weeks ago, just as a reminder, I talked about this difference between tradition and traditionalism, where tradition is the upholding of values or beliefs in a way that honors, and traditionalism relates to a really rigid implementation of those values and beliefs. So tradition is what we're doing today. We're gathering. Traditionalism is when we say we must gather. We cling because it's the right thing to do or we have to. And it seems to me that Jesus really sets an example for someone who honors tradition, in this case, in the Last Supper, breaking bread together, while simultaneously resisting traditionalism. In the middle of preparing for this talk, I don't even know what I was saying. It was probably some far-off thought. But Bill just goes, "Let me stop you right there. You do know that creating an inclusive table was the most radical thing that Jesus did, that this is what killed him."
You make me sound like a bully.
It was definitely like a hold on before you go off on one of your tangents, Holly, kind of comment.
Okay.
But it, I think, helped us contain the radicality, is that a word? It is now, of this event, of an inclusive table. He wasn't just being nice. So I'm really interested today in how we might sit in this tension, how we might go beyond being nice, because it's the right thing to do, and really challenge the status quo that seeks to divide us.
So I keep bringing this up, but if you're the first-time person here, the theme that we are following is one called the Wayless Way. It's a phrase that I stole from Meister Eckhart, the German mystic. I love it because it embraces the whole notion of non-dualism. There is a way, but it's wayless. Okay. And I think as important and healing as religion can be, we have no evidence that we can look to organized religion to be much guidance to us about this. The Western form of monotheism, and this is what I talked about a couple of weeks ago, has been the environment for the Western world for several centuries, and it is so patriarchal and it is so divisive. So the patriarchal religion that we, all of us, Jewish, Christian, Islam, any of the monotheistic religions that one could be a part of, those religions have been good at elevating men and dividing. And they have bequeathed us with, among other things, a faulty cosmology, leading us to think that the earth and humans are the most important thing in the system. It has left us with a notion of God who is powerful and yet removed. And so one of the things that happens when enormous grief comes to a community is, how could God have allowed this to happen? as if we are looking to God to do something for us special. And it has also given us a belief in the belief in redemptive violence. So it has led to the very mistaken belief that what it means to be saved is not only about some other life somewhere else, but it's a life that is very individualistic, just about me. It's about my soul. It's not about communal welfare. So the passage from the Jesus narrative we're going through, using Stephen Mitchell's version as a guide, is this. And many people who held the law in contempt began to follow Jesus, and the scribes said to him, "Why do you eat with traitors and whores?" And Jesus said to them, "It isn't the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. My teaching is not meant for those who are already righteous, but the wicked." So again, Jesus consistently chooses and prioritizes the outsider. And the way that he did that created what the religious people of his time thought was breaking the law. It was certainly complicated, and it was certainly messy, what he was doing. That is, it messed with their understanding of the way things ought to be. And it stepped outside the rules and the regulations that they had for ordering things. Now, most Christian religion in the Western world has created the belief that the purpose of religion, or a reason to be involved in religious institutions like the church, is to be saved. If you say the right prayer, if you believe the right things, then you get a one-way ticket that would help you avoid eternal flame. Jesus embraced the Jewish notion, which had absolutely nothing to do with escaping the earth. It was not some sort of spiritual evacuation plan. Salvation for Jesus meant restoration. It meant being made whole, not just in the future world, but in the world right here, right now. In the messy and complicated situation that life is. Nor is salvation some one-time tactic. It's a lifelong journey of being awakened to the reality of the love that is at the heart of the cosmos, with the hope that we can grow more and more in this love, and that would lead us to a community of love and inclusivity. Most of all, it is not personal. It is collective. So the plan that Jesus had was a salvation that liberated people from systems that dehumanized them. And he sought to remove the shame and exclusion that most religions endorse. And now for Jesus, this was not something that was up for debate. What mattered was justice. What mattered was compassion. And it mattered that it showed up in the present moment, not someday in the future, someplace else. Now I'm going to repeat, because in doing spiritual work, repetition is not redundant. This is hard. It's hard because it means giving up some notions that we may have carried from childhood. And it's just hard to do the work of making a reality this vision of a community that's inclusive of everyone. So it isn't about escaping earth. It's about restoring it. It's about healing wounds, both personal and collective. And it's about creating something that's more just, more loving, more inclusive. Now, we are right now in this broader geographical community. And Holly reminded me this week that the grief that we're experiencing about the flooding in the oil country is intergenerational. I spoke with a man 2 days ago whose daughter was airlifted out of Mystic. She was a fourth generation girl to go there. Fourth generation it's a multi-generational thing that's going on. So religion can leave us with reductionistic answers to a situation like this, but there's not a reductionistic answer to a situation like this. So we've been led to see God and religion as something that either protects us or should protect us, and when it doesn't, we give up on it. We should be saved from it. It's really ironic that people are saying that the flooding was God's will, and that if someone is saved from the flood, that was God's will. I don't see how you can have it both ways. So the spirituality that we are attempting to teach is an empowering spirituality that seeks engagement, not escape. We're seeking meaning within events, even tragic ones, not escape from them.
Yeah, well, we were going through this passage. I really didn't ever get much past the first line, which, just to repeat, says, "And many people who held the law in contempt began to follow Jesus." From where I sit today, I feel like if we can't grasp this line, that we miss the relevance of the whole passage. It represents this intersection for me of spirituality and politics. It's difficult for me in this life to separate spirituality from social work, my spiritual work from my work in the world. I want to wonder together how we might become radical companions to one another in a time when laws being passed right now are indeed contemptuous, or the failure to pass laws that led to some breakdown. So there were once laws in place that would have prohibited me from sitting and eating at the same table as my husband and my children. That's crazy. Jim Crow specifically targeted restaurants and public spaces to prevent integration. If whites and blacks were in the same establishment, white people were to be served first, and some sort of partition, visual divide, was to be placed between where the white people could eat and where the black people could eat. And the black people were often at the back, by the back door, unseen. So lunch counter sit-ins became popular ways of resisting the absurdity of these laws. And they weren't safe. They were peaceful protests, but they weren't safe. Some of you in this room were alive during Jim Crow and may have even participated in or witnessed sit-ins in your town. I've heard others of you, maybe born later in the 50s or 60s, say that as a kid you knew something wasn't right with segregation, but when you asked your adults, they just said, shh, it's the way it's always been. So even though segregation laws are no longer legally enforceable, there are shadowy remains of them in our bones and in this country in certain areas. They're present even in our city. There are parts of the I-10 corridor where my husband might still be called boy, or worse, if pulled over. Places he won't and shouldn't stop for gas. A few years ago, we took an RV trip around the Southwest, so like Texas to New Mexico to Arizona to Colorado, back through Texas. And we're driving through the Texas Panhandle in this mini Winnebago. And we stopped to eat somewhere probably near Dalhart, or part of the state that I drove to multiple times a year to get to Colorado College, where I went to undergrad, with no fear, no doubt in my mind that it was fine for me to drive to and from. But I remember specifically this day because it had rained so badly and there was this double rainbow in the sky. This is the picture I took from the parking lot of this restaurant. And when we entered, we were absolutely the only interracial non-white family to be in this restaurant. And perhaps because we were unknown, but also because we were the strange others, every head in that restaurant turned and followed us to our table. No one really said anything, they just followed with their eyes. That we are still strange in some parts is what I mean by the shadowy remnants of segregation and Jim Crow. So these sit-ins were as radical as Jesus' table. The one that included his betrayer, a tax collector turned disciple, a woman. So even though we can mostly eat and gather together with whomever we want today, without serious legal repercussions, how many of us actually do so with people not like us or with those we don't understand? I wonder if we're called then to go beyond the table. And it's hard because there is no organizing unit today like SNCC or CORE or SCLC or the Freedom Riders that's sort of guiding our action. It's hard to know where to join up. And I'm sure many of us have heard the quote often attributed to Martin Luther King that says, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." It actually originated with a white transcendentalist Unitarian preacher in Boston who was also a radical abolitionist. His name was Theodore Parker. And in 1854, after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, the Fugitive Slave Act enabled people to, or this was the origin of our police forces, enabled people to capture slaves who had found freedom and bring them back to enslavement. Even those who were never enslaved were captured and brought into enslavement. So he spoke out loudly against this. He called this act a new crime against humanity. And his sermon that inspired Martin Luther King's popularity with this quote says, "You see a continual and progressive triumph of the right. I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. From what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice." These two, Martin Luther King and Theodore Parker, are table makers. I think every person in this room, I hope every person in this room would call both Jim Crow and the Fugitive Slave Act unjust, contemptuous. Laws we ought to have contempt for, that ought to be resisted morally and spiritually. But do you know what historians and social critics say bears similarity to the Fugitive Slave Act today? Immigration raids. All these mass deportations, an issue that also needs our moral and spiritual attention. So the drawing is of the enactment of the Fugitive Slave Act, capturing someone who had either been enslaved or who never was enslaved and bringing them back with a rifle, with a horse, horsewhipped. The other picture, taken 4 years ago, is of an immigrant being horsewhipped by Border Patrol. So these two are parallel. And I believe that this is our moment to bend the arc. But it won't bend by itself. We have to bend it.
So I gave a very mixed message about religion last week and a few minutes ago. I said something about the importance of a healthy, healing expression of religion, and that I didn't think we could look to organized religion for much help. It's a mixed message. So I want to try to talk about that a minute because I think it fits what we're trying to say here. I'm very critical about religion. I hope that criticism is energizing. That's my intent. That it not be just a downer, but, oh, let's look at this another way, maybe. So I'm in a religious institution. I get paid by a church to do this. I consider myself on the inside of the edge. That makes sense? I'm never going to be senior pastor anywhere. The people that we quote mostly, Richard Rohr, Joan Chittister, Ilia Delio, Jim Finley, Thomas Merton, the list is endless. They're on the outside of the inside. By that I mean they speak about Christianity. That's their religious tradition. But they're not paid by a religious institution. It makes a tremendous difference in the freedom one has to speak about certain things. Healthy religions, healing religions, do provide ritual ways to make the move toward inclusivity. Now, they've been used to exclude. The Eucharist is meant to include everybody, but the church has used it to exclude. Kind of a paradox, but that's true. The church provides rituals, as it has this week and will in the weeks to come, for grieving families to deal with the deaths of the people who were lost in the flooding. Essential. We'll have a ritual of baptism. There are rituals of weddings. There are rituals that we have that are very important to the way that we come together and celebrate things as a community. Passages of life that that celebrate more than any individual can do alone. We need to be in community for this. At the same time, the hard data reflects that there are millions around the world who are attracted to the vision and practice of Jesus, but they're disenchanted with the way Christian churches have conducted themselves about communicating the message of Jesus. Now, if you're deeply involved, for whatever reason, in the life of this church, praise be. But I want this place also to be for people who feel that they can't or don't fit into that, for whatever reason. Now, I know that for me, my sojourn into Buddhism and Buddhist practices have enhanced my understanding of my own religious journey from birth to now. I'm not saying I'm an evolved person, but I have evolved to the point of being very clear that I do not want to have an identity that is reduced to one denomination, one nation, one culture, one religion. We're invited to be something global. It's ironic to me that in the recent Methodist church split, the division of the church that chose to exclude calls itself global. It is a fact of history. Read Karen Armstrong. Monotheistic religions divide. Division is one thing that Protestant Christianity has perfected to an art form. I grew up Southern Baptist. The last time I checked the book of denominations, there are 133 different kinds of Baptists. That's a lot.
Yeah.
So we create systems that disenfranchise and disempower, and there's something wrong about a religious system that supports a belief in a special people, special nation, one understanding of the sacred. It's so ironic that the very quality that made Jesus unique, that of unconditional love and unqualified inclusivity, is hard to find in almost any institution that bears his name. I know we say, some churches have it on their signs outside, everybody welcome. But read the fine print. And sometimes that fine print is written in invisible ink. But it's there. So look very carefully at the story we're using at the foundation of his teaching today. Jesus reveals a way to fight, even with incredible power, without becoming violent. He just invites whores and poor people to have dinner with him. And the religious people get their noses out of joint. I think Christianity stands little hope of being a force for peace and reconciliation unless and until it abandons its own divisive ways. And to be clear, practicing inclusivity and compassion is not some comfortable private undertaking. It is a dangerous political matter. I'm going to go off script a minute.
Yeah, I'm always trying to figure out where you are, but that's cool.
I'm just going to paraphrase what I've written. Religious institutions have own more property, exercise more buying power than any other institution in the United States outside the military enterprise. Churches, religious institutions, churches, private schools, universities, we have more buying power. A few years ago, some of us, back in the 60s, started a thing called Project Equality. And we tried to get churches to agree that they would not buy goods or services from any provider who did not practice equality in what they did. Racial equality was what we were going for at the time. It was a flop. It's a great idea, but it didn't work. You know why? Because most of the institutions that don't practice inclusivity are owned by Christians. Go figure. And Christian groups just can't agree on what is appropriate practice for justice and compassion.
Is it my turn?
I'm done.
Okay.
With that.
Remember, he grew up Southern Baptist. He can get going. So we've often lamented this fact that the Christian church lacks agreement on what compassion and justice looks like. The watering down of what is right and holy and good. Most of the time, I think it is really important to weigh both sides of an argument. It's actually a skill set of the 6 on the Enneagram is to be very both sidesy. But I don't here want to falsely equivocate the laws being passed right now. I want to say plainly what is happening to immigrants in this country today is wrong. And what will happen to poor women, men, and children as a result of this big, beautiful bill is wrong. It was signed into law on July 4th. Ironic. If we have any kind of commitment to Jesus, to this person we are trying to emulate, and his radical message of inclusion and equity, of building a table together, then we have a duty to resist unjust laws. Recall this saying. I love it when I quote the Bible because it's so unlike me. But I do like this verse. In Christ's family, there can be no division into Jew and non-Jew, slave and free, male and female. Among us, you are all equal. This feels as radical today as it might have felt then. Contempt for the unjust law actually places us on a moral and spiritual growth path. When we start to question the law, we're in growth, not just in rebellion. Psychologists, you've talked about Lawrence Kohlberg a lot in here over the years. He first developed the stages of moral development. And he believed that we progress kind of linearly through these stages of morality, and that in order to reach the highest stage labeled post-conventional, which is what I'm going to focus on, we have to be able to understand complex moral concepts. So our brain has to be kind of fully developed in order to get there. At stage 5, individuals recognize, so there's, within the different layers of moral development, three layers. There's pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. And within each one, there are 2 stages, 1 through 6, 1 being the lowest level of moral development and 6 being conceivably the highest. Did you know that Lawrence Kohlberg was starting to grapple with a 7th layer? And then he killed himself.
That's not very moral.
Nah, it's an interesting dilemma.
Yeah.
An interesting internal war with himself, right? So at stage 5, in post-conventional morality, individuals begin to recognize that laws are social contracts that can be changed if they are unjust. Examine the law, change it if it doesn't work. And in stage 6, individuals base their moral judgments on universal ethical principles like justice, equality, and human rights, even if these principles conflict with societal norms and have negative consequences. So people who were bold enough to change the law from separating restaurants between whites and coloreds were exercising their stage 6 capacity, right? I spent a lot of time studying Kohlberg at the Harvard Ed School, and there's actually a room named for him where he pioneered his work. It's a little dark room, and this is where it is said that he did what are called fishbowl exercises. One of these exercises is called the Heinz Dilemma, which asks participants to discuss whether this man named Heinz should steal medicine for his dying wife that he could not afford. Should he break the law for a good cause? And in researching his theory, I learned that Kohlberg only studied males, and at that, only white males. And he concluded that females were less likely to reach stage 6 because we are too relational and prioritize care over justice.
Maybe he didn't commit suicide, but his wife killed him.
Maybe. Oh, the things you joke about. So in his levels of moral development, a lot of this depended on what does the individual do? What does the individual do in this dilemma? His protege, Carol Gilligan, who I also studied a lot, who she herself studied at the Harvard Ed School under him or with him, evolved his theory to say that an ethic of care is precisely, don't even try to read that small print, I'm just demonstrating that she also had levels of moral development. And she concluded that an ethic of care is needed in order to evolve morally. I say it's both care and justice that we need in order to reach higher levels of morality and spirituality. So we need the masculine and the feminine. To quote Martin Luther King again, power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. Similarly, in our spiritual development, we also pass through stages that evolve from more dualistic thinking to active engagement. Black-white thinking to kind of being able to hold that gray area and act accordingly. Ken Wilber, who to me has developed the most complicated system, but somewhat we can kind of simplify it to a degree. He names these stages of spiritual development: cleaning up, that's a lower level of spiritual development, marked by dualism, that black-white understanding of the world. When we progress, we start to grow up, we start to be able to hold complexity, can start to think, oh, maybe that everything is not so black and white, there are gray areas here. Then waking up, marked by a deepening awareness, an ability to embrace paradox, again requires some kind of brain development that comes with age and wisdom. And then finally showing up, marked by actively participating and contributing to the greater good. In other words, our spirituality is anemic if we don't show up in the world with it. To love justly, to show up, means to think of God as more of an event or an action rather than an entity or some faraway substance. Again, emphasizing this intersection of spiritual and social work. It means to live in a way that we may not necessarily feel secure. So living in this way of showing up, or at this stage 6 moral development, is not necessarily safe. It requires us to take risks. And we may, in fact, get hurt. And we may feel grief. And we may not belong. We might suffer. I know I'm making it sound awesome. But I am certain of this, that if we start to follow that path, we will also find greater connectedness, because we are bound to each other. And when we learn to share power and love, we're honoring that interconnectedness.
So here's something that you probably didn't expect to hear in church.
Go break the law.
Jesus asked those who followed him to break the law. Now, he couched that request or demand, depending on how you hear it, in such a velvet glove that those who heard it didn't realize what had happened to them until after the fact. So I'm going to jump ahead in the Jesus narrative. We'll get to this story later more completely sometime as we're going through Mitchell's material. But there's a story that Jesus told that is one of the 2 most popular stories that Jesus told. Even if you've never walked into the door of a church, you've heard this story because it's been made into movies. It's called the story of the Good Samaritan. Everybody knows it. So this guy is left half dead beside the road. Now, if you're half dead in that time, nobody could touch you without becoming unclean. And if you were unclean, you were put outside the community, right? So that's why the priest and Levite walked by on the other side of the half-dead men. It wasn't that they were not caring people. They may have been the most caring people in the world. They just didn't want to become unclean because that meant they couldn't go to work and get paid. It's a reasonable thing. So the Samaritan, this hated person, goes and helps the guy, gets him clean. And Jesus has asked, this is a whole setup for Jesus. By the way, it's a gospel selection for today. Jesus is asked, who is my neighbor? And so Jesus tells the story, and then he says to the guy who asked the question, who was neighbor to the man in need? And the answer is obvious. It's the one who showed compassion. All right? And Jesus said, well, go do likewise. However, since the Samaritan had touched this Jewish man, he was now unclean. And anybody he went and touched would also be unclean. Now, what were his neighbors going to think of him if he did that? He would also be ostracized, criticized, put outside. You know, I heard this story as a kid growing up in church, and what I heard was this nice little moral, be nice to everybody. That's not what it's saying. It's saying break the law of what you think is conventional so that you can show compassion and practice justice. As I said, the wayless way is messy.
You had your moment with this story this week, the same that I had with Jacob and the angel, where it became something totally new for you.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Look, at 87, we're still evolving. Yeah. I'm sorry, 108, however old you are.
I'm 114.
Yeah, okay, yeah. He gets older every week. So I think the point here is there's a sacrifice that comes with breaking the unjust law. It's what I came to call, it's a word I made up for the purposes of my dissertation. You can do that apparently when you write a dissertation, you can make up words. And they become real words. And I call this unbelonging. It's when we're willing to sit with the different but no less sacred other at the proverbial table. And when we do this, we directly challenge the status quo. We also challenge our position in the status quo. We risk rejection from what is comfortable. But I'll say, if there is no change, if there's no growth, if we keep choosing security, we might stay safe, but we won't become more whole or more free. We'll be safe. Again, counterphobic 6 is love safety. But we also have to press against that seduction of safety to become whole and free. Today we're experiencing what Mark Twain called the rhyming nature of history. We've not been exactly here, but we've been somewhere close. We've seen these remnants before. They're tools available to us, ones that we don't have to reinvent. And each of us who observes injustice, I think, has the right to respond to it. We're rooted in this tradition that advocates for nonviolence, for the simple but radical act of breaking bread together in circumstances that seek to divide. So I'll echo what was taught from pulpits and churches alike in the 60s. I think you were trying to do this in your work. Not that offers us a philosophy of nonviolence, and a philosophy of nonviolence is one that does require courage and resistance and a commitment ultimately to reconciliation. There's so many ways we can slide in, and the goals of nonviolent action, which I believe we need today, are first information gathering, so read, learn, understand what's going on, education, deepening that understanding, personal commitment, how will I show up? In what groups will I belong? How will I treat my neighbor? Negotiation, so I learned this, that in cities, in order to have a protest, you have to negotiate with the lawmakers for the terms of that protest to be protected so that it remains nonviolent. So you're negotiating with the people who are there not just to protect, but to defend. So there's an immediate coming to the table with someone who may have different aims than you do, and just in preparing a protest in a city. And then there's direct action, participating in something that pushes the envelope forward. And then reconciliation, that's the wholeness. That's what the ultimate goal is. I'll end with this quote attributed to Lao Tzu, and we defied it. We can act without doing and teach without speaking, which is not what Bill and I have done. But what this encourages us to do is to join in this great flow, the wayless way, without exerting dominance and control. Just being in the philosophy such that our very presence aligns with love and justice and compassion.
So I want to tell you a story that never happened, but it's true. You remember the painting that Holly showed that's in Milan?
Mm-hmm.
So that table was reconvened. The very same scene was reconvened. And the people who gathered, the teacher and his students, for this meal. And food was put on the table. Nobody ate because they were waiting for the teacher to give us the blessing that was traditional before the Jewish Seder meal. And he didn't give it. He just sat there. Sometimes he closed his eyes. They had seen him do that so often. Sometimes he opened his eyes and he looked at each one lovingly, piercingly, searchingly. And time passed. We don't know how long. In this kind of story, cosmic time, 1,000 years is a second is 1,000 years, who knows? But they wait. And before long there is a knock on the door, and the teacher opens his eyes and looks and says, "Come in." And the door cracks a little bit, and then opens wider, and the teacher has a smile on his face, and it breaks into a guffaw. And the teacher says, "Oh, Judas, it's you. I'm so glad you've shown up. We have been waiting for you." We couldn't start without you. No matter where you go this week, no matter what happens, remember this: you carry precious cargo, so watch your step, and I'll see you here next Sunday, and you'll get the email in the morning. Thank you for being here.